This is a conversation I've been waiting for a very long time. Drew Steigerwald is the editor-in-chief of 1440, a daily newsletter with 3 million subscribers and an astonishing 60% open rate. The unique thing about this conversation is that Drew and I are both working on the exact same problem. We don't like the fact that people consume low-quality news, and we want to help people consume higher-quality information with a focus on more facts and less partisanship. We also have similar-sized audiences. 1440 has 3 million subscribers, and the Otherweb has 5.6 million. But at the same time, we're going about the problem in a completely different way. 1440 uses the old-school tools of meticulous editorial review and original writing, whereas the Otherweb uses the high-tech approach of software scraping, AI models, and recommendation systems. I think you'll all enjoy hearing a completely different perspective on this, which, in my view, still achieves the same goal quite admirably. I encourage everyone to check out 1440's newsletter at join1440.com. They are certainly a force for good, and while I obviously prefer our own product, I am still subscribed to 1440 and love what they're doing. Hey Drew, welcome to the show.
Hey Alex, how's it going? Thanks for having me on.
No problem. I'm a big fan of 1440, but for those of my viewers who don't know what it is, can you tell me a bit about it?
Sure. So we're at 1440 Daily Digest. We're a daily news email with more than 3 million readers at the moment. We're getting pretty close to 3.1. We focus on two value props for our audience. The first is bringing together a comprehensive view of what's going on in the world each day. So we try and go across all the topics that you might find in the news, so sports, science and tech, politics, business. We bring it together in one place that's easily digestible for sort of a general audience. And then the second is more stylistic in our approach. We put a premium on conveying fact-forward, impact and outcome-focused, impartial as humanly possible news and information. So those are the two things that we think we do in sort of a world-class way: bring together unbiased news and information and do it across all the topics. So basically, if you're a busy reader, let's say you're an accountant in Kansas City, you got 3 kids, and you only have 10 minutes to catch up on the world, but you want to know what's going on, we think 1440 can be that morning news digest for you. We're in year 6, actually, which is pretty amazing to think about. So we started in 2017. Myself and my co-founder, Tim, neither of us have media or journalism experience. Actually, Tim was in finance, and my background is science and politics. So I have a PhD in physics, and I left lab to work on Capitol Hill for a little bit, bounced around in DC doing science policy before starting 1440. But back in 2017, Tim and I were basically complaining to each other about how difficult it was to just stay up to date on what's going on in the world. It sounds like it wouldn't be a problem, but we had jobs where, I'm already an expert in science, but my job required me to know it, to be informed about what was going on in the business and finance world, even entertainment, just to have casual conversations with people during meetings. And we would literally spend, no joke, we would spend 90 minutes each morning going through various websites, reading different newsletters. The issue is that everybody sort of does this mile deep, inch wide approach. And what we were looking for was an inch deep, mile wide approach. And we couldn't figure out why no one had done this at that point. So we put pen to paper, created a sort of a draft of the vision for the product that we felt met our needs. And then we did, like a good little startup, we did a MVP process, iterated it with a small group of friends and family, and then spent the next couple years scaling it up and turning it into a real business. So that's where we're at right now. We focus we're focused on building a sustainable, independently owned news media business that can deliver for millions of readers each morning.
Sure. So it sounds like you and I are essentially trying to solve the exact same problem, maybe even for the same people, but in very different ways. We ended up with an app that scrapes 900 different sources and lets the user configure a feed from something like 30,000 items per day. You ended up with one newsletter that has a limited number of items in it. So can you explain to me what led to this decision? Why do you think this is the best way to solve the problem that you described?
Sure. Yeah. So one thing I kind of I'll apologize in advance because I tend to repeat this point. I'm just going to keep beating this drum until people stop listening to me. But I think one of the upsides of not having any media or journalism experience is we came into this as quite literally as like news consumers, frustrated news consumers. We had our own problems with the way that news and information was delivered by like traditional media outlets and other places on the internet. So when we came in, we knew what the sort of the problem set that we needed to solve for that type of news consumer, which was like us, like busy professionals that don't have a ton of time but need to stay up on things. And so the reason I say it like that is when you think about it through that lens, there's actually like a set of problems. I say problems, but like challenges that we saw that basically impeded delivering information to the consumer. So there's, this is our perspective, but news, there's too much of it. It's a lot of it isn't news. On any given day, estimating a little bit here, but 90% of what you read in like the news or media space is not really news, but it's like perspective or analysis, or somebody said something or something might happen or something like that. And, our viewpoint is that it's not that that stuff isn't valuable or even interesting to like a certain slice of, news readers, but it's not actually news, right? Like nothing's actually happening. And so, one of the big challenges was how do you skim off that? Again, I don't want to use I don't want to cast it in a negative light, but kind of like remove that sort of fluff from what is, what happened that actually has like a concrete outcome in the world, and just like get kind of straight to the point there. So too much information, too much opinion. Often writing is structured in a way that doesn't explain context up front for the reader. You have to, even within a single article, you have to kind of go dig for it and put the pieces together yourself. And then again, we'll probably keep returning to this point. But, I think it's a well-known issue. There's a lot of news outlets that we have a ton of respect for them, but a lot of the content is framed through a certain lens, if that makes sense. So, thinking through these different problems, too much, a lot of it's not news, too much opinion, too much bias. It actually, what we found is the less is more approach really resonated with people. Again, especially for that type of news consumer that's really does want to know what's going on, but just doesn't have a ton of time.
Yeah, so first of all, I completely agree with you on your diagnosis of the problem. I still, every time I read an article that talks about somebody being outraged that somebody else didn't comment on an event that happened before, and I try to dig through the links in the article to get to the original event, and I just can't find it anywhere. Right? That seems like it's no longer news at that point.
Have you ever been stuck in the doom loop? It's what I call it, at least, where it's, you search and you search for, let's say it's like the original event. A lot of times it'll happen. I'm actually not making this up. I'll just cherry pick something from a couple months ago. But let's say Elon Musk is on stage at an event and he says XYZ, and then there's a ton of ink spilled about it. And you're, okay, you read the article, but to be thorough, you want to just see what he said so you can hear it yourself and then come up with your own opinion on it. So you read through the article, takes 5 to 10 minutes to find the link. You think you found the link, you click on it, and you think it's going to take you to I don't know, a YouTube video of the remarks, and it just takes you to another article from the same outlet about Elon Musk again. It's kind of infuriating. Not to get on my soapbox or anything.
Yeah. And especially if the original thing that somebody said is deemed inappropriate, then nobody actually publishes the original remark because that would be inappropriate. And so you just can't find it anywhere.
Agree. It's frustrating sometimes.
So let me try to understand then how you solve this problem for your readers, and how do you convince your readers that your take on the situation is actually the correct, unbiased view that basically gives them everything they need to know for the day. How do you convince them that they can trust you?
Sure. Great question. I feel sometimes when I answer this question, it's one of my favorite. People roll their eyes or think I'm hedging or something, but it's the truth. We actually don't. So we don't put ourselves out there as an arbiter of truth. We're the 100% correct, authoritative outlet. We know what's right and everybody else doesn't. It's not like that. Actually, our tagline is unbiased as humanly possible. And the way that we approach things is again, going back to how the company was founded, quite literally, we're frustrated news consumers and we're humans just like everybody else who's trying to understand what's going on in the world. So our approach there is we don't have the absolute answer, but our job is to spend time trying to figure it out and learn about it and convey that information to the reader so that they don't have to. We're lucky to be in a position where we can spend 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day parsing through these different reports and, analyses to package something for other people. That said, a lot of the words I think that get used, so I've already said a bunch: unbiased, impartial, facts. Everybody says these things, right? And the only way that you can convince someone that you're making your best good faith effort to pull together that type of product is quite literally just to put it in front of them. So it's interesting. We've actually, sort of without going into the weeds of email strategy, we actually found that the best way, when someone has signed up for 1440, the best way to get them to stick around as a reader is to skip all of the welcome emails, all that stuff, and just put the product in front of them and let them read it and make a decision. It's not for everybody. We actually think in terms of, we call it a psychographic instead of a demographic. So there's sort of, if you think of the profile of news consumers as this bell curve, and on the edges of the bell curve, you have people who are hyper news consumers, and they tend to be, there's strong correlation with being fairly ideological. It's not always true, but those two things kind of go hand in hand a lot of times. We're probably not for them, which is fine. I think they would read, the digest and say, you're not framing it in the correct way, whether it's this side or that side. The issue is that most media, this is our observation, most media and their business models are built around catering to that sort of hyper news consumer. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's probably a much longer conversation, but we focus on basically the middle. And I don't necessarily mean the middle politically. It's more if you listen to what our readers tell us, it's not that they don't have opinions. They certainly do. But what they've been looking for is an outlet that informs without telling them what to think, right? So we put the utmost emphasis on helping people understand what's going on, and just, after that, they can go off and form their own opinions. That's not our job. Our job is to give them the tools to go out and like understand, and then they can, come to their own conclusions. And so, just to like tie a bow on that long answer there, the only way to prove it is to just do it and put it in front of them. And I think, I hate to use like a cliche, but in some sense, the proof is in the pudding. We do have like 3 million readers, but I think more importantly, and to the question, the it's roughly a third like self-identified left-leaning, a third self-identified right-leaning, and like to the extent that you believe people when they say they're independent, a third like independent or centrist. And you can't build that type of audience profile unless day in and day out you're doing your best to like meet the mark on the impartiality side.
Right. So I saw some research from Reuters last year that showed that in the US, 42% of adults are consciously avoiding the news right now. I'm guessing a lot of those are your potential target audience because you're fixing the things that are the reasons they avoid the news.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to try and not go off on a tangent because I don't do the surveys and it's not my area of expertise. When I do read the surveys, and they're very interesting, everybody should go read them. They're very informative. I question if you sometimes you like go into the methodology and you look at like what constitutes an active newsreader or a semi-active newsreader. That's not really it's not exactly the words that they use, but it basically gets boxed as someone who checks like a major news outlet once a week is like considered a sometimes newsreader. If it's more than that, they fall into that like active avoiding box. Um, so the answer is yes. However, I think you would be surprised at the number of people that do actively like would fall in that active news consumer box. So let's say daily reading of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, who still subscribe to 1440, partly for efficiency. I'm just sort of going like I'm going to spit back some of the things readers tell us, but especially now, a lot of the bigger outlets have begun to specialize less in sort of direct and efficient communication of news. Like this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And I mean, you can just, it's not like it's not even an experiment. You can just open up the New York Times and look on their digital front page and you'll see like human interest piece, perspective piece, analysis. And so a lot of our audience does read, they do read these various outlets, but then they rely on 1440 to sort of fill in like that extra coverage. So there's a lot of utility, I think, for the vast majority of newsreaders. We think the total market is like in the tens of millions. And I think primarily the folks that are turned off by it are the ones that tend to be like more ideological in nature.
So I want to get back to the question of impartiality and use myself as an example here to demonstrate what I think is the risk. In that maybe on the left-right axis in American politics, I could be impartial. And if you magically turned me into the editor of the New York Times tomorrow, I think I would do a much better job than their actual editor at being right there in the middle and covering both sides fairly. But I grew up in Israel. So the moment you pick a topic like Israel-Palestine today, now I don't trust myself anymore. I have to outsource it to somebody who doesn't have my history, just because as much as I will try to be impartial, I am never quite sure. So our approach at the Otherweb has been, let's let AI models do it and let's open up the source and then people can judge whether they're going to be impartial or not. But if you have humans do it, how do you avoid these kind of biases on the smaller, more specific issues where a person's personal history might affect them?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I'd say it's one of the biggest challenges, right? Like one of the most difficult things is being self-aware about your own biases, especially the ones you're not aware of, right? I'm going to answer like in a roundabout way, so you can keep pushing if I don't satisfy the question here. But so, what's interesting? I wouldn't have thought this when we started, but over time, it sort of became this like fundamental approach to how we do things. So we our branding and our positioning and our style and the product is framed as this unbiased as humanly possible. What I find interesting is we don't get out of bed in the morning saying, today I'm going to go make the least biased email news product that we can. What we focus on is like explaining what's going on. And I know that sounds obvious and maybe like table stakes, so to speak, but explaining and contextualizing things. So if you read a story, so I'm just going to speak for myself. Pick up the paper, I read whatever's on the front page. As I'm reading, I'm having questions like naturally occur to me. So just to make up an example, let's say it's not about Israel Palestine, but it's about immigration policy in the U.S. and it's from earlier this year. But say Title 42 ends, so it's an immigration policy for like border flows and so on and so forth. So I'm reading it, and it says, Title 42 ends. So my first natural question is, well, how many people did it affect? How many people were coming across the border were subject to that authority? Of them, like what percentage of total like border encounters was Title 42 responsible for? Sounds like I'm getting way off track, but my point is that these questions naturally occur to me. And of the frustrations that I listed at the beginning, in the way that like traditional news outlets convey information, to me, like I don't know what it means to say like Title 42 is ending if I don't know how many people it affects, and of that, like what percentage of total people come across the border. So you go out and you're trying to answer these questions, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like a mini research project. And I use this kind of convoluted example, but it's the same for almost every story, including, the majority of what's going on in Gaza. When you focus on trying to answer those contextual questions and you only have 150 to 200 words to write, that focus on answering those questions, because if you have those questions, other people have those questions, you actually naturally end up with something that is perceived by the readers as unbiased or impartial. That was very wordy, mm-hmm. But to sort of sum it up, I agree with you. Like understanding your own biases is probably like the most important thing, so the most difficult thing. However, when your mission is to like explain, help people learn, help contextualize, it's actually surprising like how little, not little, but it is almost like a secondary challenge to like make sure what you've put out there is as unbiased as possible. The last thing I'll say is like in the 6 years that we've been doing this, what's going on in Israel right now is probably one of the most difficult and challenging things to write about. So it's somewhat like unique in that regard. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, it's unique in the sense that it doesn't quite correlate to the left-right axis we typically have in our politics, right? That might be the complication, that you actually don't have these axes. They are orthogonal in some sense.
Yeah, no, certainly I agree with that. I think that's also reflected in the reader feedback that we get each time we write about it. So,
all right. So leaving those contentious topics aside for a second, why did you choose email as opposed to websites, as opposed to apps, as opposed to maybe even print journalism or video, which many other alternative media sources do today?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple threads there. So one is actually just there's a lot less friction in starting something with that's like email first. It's you have the tools are already out there. So if you rewind to 2017, Tim and I, had this problem as news consumers. We knew we had the problem. The question was, does anybody else have this problem and frustration with us? So to test that, you're able to take basically off the shelf tools. When we started, we used MailChimp and create a product and go out and test it and see if people, if it like resonates with people and like adds value, solves problems in their day to day. But I think like more broadly, it's less news related. It goes back to push versus pull. So like if you're an email first company, you have to do a lot more work on the front end to build the audience. But once you have built the audience, they trust you. It sounds a little bit weird to say, but when you're in someone's inbox, it's actually like there's almost like a tacit agreement that like, they've like let you in. They're not deleting you. They're reading you. So there's this like little trust ecosystem going on there. From a business perspective, it's much more monetizable than the pull version, which is like websites, which I think you see a lot of like, the last 18 months has seen a ton of media organizations either do riffs or just go bankrupt. And a lot of it is when you have a website, you have to rely on people coming to your website versus you showing up in their inbox. And so the flip side, like on the email side, it's easier you got to do a lot more work to build your audience. On the website, you don't got to do a ton of work to build your audience. Anybody can just like come. You want to raise some awareness, but then they don't stick around and they got to remember to come back and come back and come back. And it's, we did this at kind of an interesting time. Substack started, I think in 2017 when we started as well. And I think when we started, people were like, emails, that's pretty old school. That's boring. And then like it went through this like trajectory where Substack became a hit and everybody had newsletters. Then we had peak newsletter, started to get back down. Now you see even like companies, so like Semaphore, for example, has taken like what I would call a hybrid approach. I think even they describe themselves as like email forward or email first, but they do have a website. So they have a website, but like the ability to engage your audience and really have like consistent daily engagement, which again, like one, you have a great connection with your audience. Two, it's much easier to monetize and build a sustainable business model around. They've adopted that, and Axios has done the same thing. So I think people will finally come around to like the value proposition of using email. And like again, for the third time, coming in as like a news consumer and not someone from media background. To me, it's email, podcast, website, smoke signals, whatever. Like what you're trying to do is convey useful information to people and they find like a value add in the product that you're giving them. And to me, email is like the medium, and there's a lot of advantages to it. But again, whether it's a website or whatever, it's about delivering that to the news consumer.
Right, but it seems like most media organizations try to go in an all of the above approach. They try to have a newsletter and a website and apps and basically every other medium possible. You chose email, which sounds like it makes user acquisition more difficult, but it makes user retention possibly easier because they have to actively opt out as opposed to just remembering to come the next day. How do you solve the user acquisition problem then? It seems like that is the make it or break it problem if email is your medium.
Yeah. yeah. Getting customers, that's the make or break problem. This is a really fascinating question. It's probably worth like a whole other conversation. I'm gonna give like an in the weeds answer. So frankly, it depends on where you're at in the stage of your company and what you want to be. So by that I mean, by the second part I mean, let's say you're like a quote unquote lone operator. So Matt Iglesias, for example, you're not trying to build a big media empire. I don't know. He might be. I shouldn't speak for him, but really the value there is in his writing. The only thing he's trying to do is like get his stuff out to his audience. So in that case, you don't need to go build a big like business infrastructure. You just have to rely on like the Substack tools to build your audience. If you want to be, so the flip side of that, so our business model, we have two ad placements per day, and it's the digest is 100% free, so you can sign up at any time. So we like our financial model is based on building the audience and charging advertisers for engagement that they find in the email. So when you're small and you can't attract, advertisers, you have to be creative. So you like partner with other newsletters. You do swaps. You say, I'll feature you and ours if you feature us, and you slowly build your audience until you get to the point where you can rely on paid acquisition. So paid acquisition means like advertising on Instagram, advertising on TikTok. Actually, like if we only had to choose one way to acquire new customers, would actually be through other newsletters. In terms of like lifetime value and retention, those readers always tend to be just exceptional. The problem is it doesn't scale as well as obviously places like Instagram, Facebook, the social media platforms, stuff like that. So again, to summarize, as you get bigger, you grow your audience until you can attract advertisers, and once you have revenue, you lean really heavily into paid acquisition.
Right, makes sense. Right, so you mentioned there are tens of millions of potential customers that you want to reach eventually.
I think so, yeah.
What is the long-term plan then? Will you reach them in the next 4 or 5 years? If so, then how? Is it just paid advertising that gets you there? Or is there some place where those guys congregate? And are you going to offer them anything beyond the newsletter that you have now? Do you have plans to build other products?
Yeah, to answer the first question, paid acquisition is like pretty powerful. We've had a lot of success with it. I've heard some stories from other outlets experiencing some challenges. We've still been doing pretty well. So I think like that it's combined with organic sort of word of mouth. Once you get to a certain size, you begin to reap the benefits of people, mentioning to their friends that they read 1440, or the more people hear about it, eventually people just, look you up and sign up. So there's a significant percentage of organic traffic that we also get. So yeah, I wish I could wow you with a strategy to go out and get, the next 3 million and the next 3 million after that. But today, I think we feel like we still have like a fairly clear roadmap, pursuing the same strategy on the daily digest side. And I'm knocking on wood pretty heavily because you never know what'll happen. In some sense, you're like reliant, you're subject to the whims of changes on the platforms that you advertise on. So we'll see how especially like privacy things can affect just like the cost to acquire a new reader. So we'll see how that develops in the next couple of years. So that's kind of the boring answer to the first one. We feel like we still have a lot of runway. The answer to the second one. So I'm gonna, if you would allow me, I'm gonna just like riff and use my imagination a little bit here. So I think one of the things that we've been lucky, we've been successful. I think a lot of it's predicated on the fact that we started the company to solve a problem that we knew existed. Right? Just to again repeat myself, we had this problem. We weren't going out searching for a problem. It wasn't, oh, everybody is complaining about news. Let's go see if we're the ones who can fix it. We just knew there was a problem. And one of the things that our audience has taught us over the last 6 years is there's millions of people who read the news, number one, to stay informed, of course, like you want to know what's going on. But number two, it's like the manifestation of like a deeper curiosity. So, I think there's a ton of people who, they read a news article about CRISPR. So I think it was late Friday or our Saturday edition. covered the FDA approval for CRISPR treatment to treat sickle cell. And it's beneficial for someone, again, like the vast majority of people aren't CRISPR experts. So they read the news item, they remember it. But there's a deeper level of like fascination, curiosity, the urge to like know more. Like, how does CRISPR work? What is a gene? Can you really just go in and snip something out and like reconnect it? How does that all work? And if you aren't an expert in that area, you don't know where to go look. It sounds like a trivial problem, but you actually don't know where to go to just learn more. Not as an expert, but like, again, you're an accountant in Kansas City with 3 kids and you're super busy, but you're like fascinated by CRISPR or black holes, or you've always read about how like the Federal Reserve, but no one ever really explained it to you. One thing like I've realized is there's this huge demand for like that learning. And that's not really news. News is about what's happening today. But we have this kind of like thing we say internally, which is like news is the entree to knowledge, which sounds a little corny, but I think it's pretty true. And you take that, and then I think there's this larger problem, just to go like way big here. In the same way that the like traditional news outlets weren't conveying, at least in our opinion, like weren't conveying news and information efficiently to news consumers, the internet actually, in my view, doesn't do a great job at delivering like knowledge, which sounds like nonsense, right? Anybody can go to Google and punch in CRISPR. The problem is you punch in CRISPR and you get 9 billion results, which is like a technically amazing feat, but not very useful for the average person. And on top of that, it's been, I'm not the first person to say this, but the SEO games have like made it more difficult to find something that's digestible for an accountant in Kansas City that doesn't have a bunch of time but wants to understand stuff. And that person wouldn't know to go, for example, to Harvard's Weiss Institute, where they have a really excellent 2-minute animation on CRISPR that's really easily understandable for your average person. And I've just once we realize that there's this like demand, like our audience like really loves it when we include these like we go out, we do the hard work, we surface these resources, we stick them in there, and people they just engage with it like crazy. So there's huge demand for that, but you don't know where to go look. So there's this mismatch problem where you have a bunch of people that like want to learn about fascinating stuff, and then you have like the internet's like the marketplace, and it's not like really delivering it for them, right? So I said a lot of words without answering your question in a specific way, but that's what we've been thinking about, right? So there's like news, and then there's like knowledge, and it's out there, but there's just a disconnect between the people that want it and the organizations that are providing it.
Interesting. So if I try to organize everything like an engineer into boxes, right? The news is the subset of information that happened recently and is worth reporting on, right? You're talking about now that somebody is reading the news, let's take them into the even smaller subset of information that has been validated in some way and is therefore knowledge. Is that a reasonable way to look at it?
Yes, I think you captured it. Although I would say I actually think I don't think it's a smaller subset. So the way I would think about it is just to use like the Israeli-Palestine, Israeli-Gaza conflict right now. There's a lot of really high quality resources out there that existed before the current war that are just sort of out across the internet. There's maps, there's interactive looks at the history, and it's just like scattered. And maybe this example is not the best because in this case, those resources actually may be a little bit easier to find, but the point sort of remains. And so every time you read a news item about Palestine, Israel, Gaza, it sits on top of this broader base of knowledge. And it's that broader base that people don't get in their day-to-day experience, right? It's almost just a practical problem. If you don't do this as your job, you don't have 30 minutes to go poke around the internet to find the best, history of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, to stay in that current example. So, I actually think it's like bigger than, right. It's like explaining, to take one of my favorite examples, like black holes. How do black holes form? What do black holes do to like space time, nerdy stuff, right? But people love it. Then the news on like an every other day basis is like black hole discovered. James Webb spots this. That's like news, but it sits on top of this like really fascinating broader base of knowledge that's just like disaggregated across the internet, in our opinion.
Yeah, so another engineering model I can propose here is you're talking about making it all two-dimensional. So if you're talking about something CRISPR, then I can ask you, CRISPR, what's that? You tell me it's a way to edit genes. I say, genes, what's that? Yeah. And we can just dive all the way down.
Exactly. And it's just to keep pushing on that example, because my wife is a biologist and I'm not. I took my last biology class when I was a sophomore in college. You can have that conversation. But what's more powerful is actually a simple 2-minute animation made by an expert that's buried on like the Harvard Weiss Institute, as I mentioned earlier. And the problem is you and I can sit here and talk about what's a gene, how does it work, or we can just go watch this really great short video and just visualize it and come to a better understanding of how it works. It's the problem is like someone made that and it's just like sitting out there. And you don't. It's this like disaggregation problem. So
I think perhaps the most complicated part of that is finding the animation that explains it at the right level. Because I've seen people who can explain physics at the level of a physics PhD. I've seen people who can explain physics to a 5-year-old child. And I've seen very few people who can explain it at some level in the middle. That's like the right way for somebody who took a couple of physics courses in college and hasn't looked at it since. It's really difficult to find an explanation of, I don't know, Dirac's equation at a level that I would understand and interest me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we think sort of fundamentally, it's a curation problem, right? So the internet aggregates, but it would be more preferable if it curated.
So let's dive into that a little bit, especially now that it looks like generative AI is going to generate a lot more stuff on the internet. So the size of the pile is going to grow much faster than it has grown until now. Curation will become that much more difficult, especially for humans. How do you plan to address that?
Yeah, so I would answer, I'd actually like push back, hopefully, and say curation may become more difficult, maybe remains to be seen. I also would argue that it will become more valuable. There's a lot of details in there that we'll see how they develop. If you're curating content, how do you know what's been generated or not, or how do you go out and verify things? I think those are questions all TBD. I do personally, this is just pure, looking at my thumb and feeling which way the wind's blowing. I do feel like there will be sort of a zeitgeist, at least for a little bit, against the sort of AI generated stuff. You already see it with some of these places like CNET. There was one today. Actually, I think it was Israeli based financial website that was busted for using AI to copy competitors' content. So yeah, there will be a proliferation of mediocre content in the short term, would be my guess. Yeah, no, it'll become more difficult, but I think like that increases the value of having a trusted outlet where you can rely on people to curate stuff that's sort of human produced. I'm going to steal this. I can't remember where I heard this, but it was recently, and I think we can assume that AI won't always be like this, but we're in this phase where it feels like the stuff that's being made in the way that you see sort of online is like having a bad junior assistant. So like, you can't really trust it.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly the case for now, because when you train an AI model on the entire internet, there's essentially no way of telling it in advance without going through the content yourself, which content is valuable, which content is not. Right. So the only thing that determines what it considers true is frequency. If it encountered a certain claim more than its inverse, then this claim must be true. Which I saw a really fun example, probably the best one I've seen so far, of an April's Fool's joke that was posted by the Lithuanian government that basically turned into knowledge as far as GPT is concerned, because nobody posted the opposite of this April's Fool's joke. So it was 1-0. Therefore, it must be true.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's not my area of expertise. I think you're much more qualified to talk about it than I am. It does feel like right now we're in this phase of interesting, but can't necessarily trust the output. And I do think a lot of, at least speaking to our audience, you can already sense there's already a sense of like wariness, like not weariness, but wariness of what was generated by a computer. To what degree can I trust it? Um, so yeah, it's currently we find that sort of curation challenge back to the question of how do you go about selecting unbiased or impartial content. Most of the work is in making decisions on what not to include, if that makes sense. And I think that will just continue and become more paramount as you have more like proliferation of the AI content. You got to do a lot of legwork in deciding like, don't include this, don't include this, don't include this.
All right. Last question. I understand the what and I understand the how, but why? What is the greater meaning or the purpose of what you're trying to achieve?
Wonderful question. I've thought about this a lot. There's not a way to say this that doesn't sound at least somewhat cheesy, but I do believe it. I really strongly believe that most people can have intelligent, rational conversations with each other, even if they disagree. What they need or what they look for is a common set of like facts or contextual information. We felt like that wasn't being provided in an efficient way. Apologies to all of our friends at larger media outlets that they listen to this. But yeah, no, that's why. Like, I really, coming from science, you spend all day, every day questioning like your own work, trying to prove it to yourself, trying to poke holes in it. And when you do that, you develop a much deeper understanding of what you're working on. When you translate that to news or news media or information, going out and understanding the contextual stuff first before you make up your conclusion or your opinion means it gives you the confidence that your opinion is like sitting on solid ground. And if you feel like that, you can have a rational conversation with someone else who knows the same things but came to a different conclusion. So again, I know it's like sounds cheesy because like I'm definitely not the first person to say that, but I honestly do believe that like we just there's millions of people out there that are like that, and they're not necessarily the people whose voices are heard when traditional like news media is like building their business and deciding what content and how to write. Does that make sense?
So you're trying to create the substrate on which people can have a conversation. What traditional media tries to do is tell you what to think, so you exactly say what they told you to, right?
That's a flattering way of putting it. Thank you. I also want to say again, like it's not that we think everybody else is doing it wrong necessarily. It's more that when we were looking 6 years ago, an alternative option wasn't there. And so, people can't choose something else if the alternative doesn't exist.
Well, that makes total sense. And I really support your mission. I love the product and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for coming here.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It was wonderful. Appreciate it.
This has been another episode of the Otherweb. Join us next time for more discussions about news, media, AI, and everything in between.